So for today, we have a conference title, It's What You Learn After You Know It All That Counts. So we leave university with a great deal of enthusiasm and idealism, but how prepared are we to follow our dreams? As time passes, we start to realize that our technical education is just a tiny part of what it takes to be successful in our career and in life generally, and that we lack of other essential knowledge and skills. This presentation will introduce important concepts about other aspects of our education that really matters, but which are rarely taught in a formal setting. We will learn that it really is what we learn after we know it all that counts, and that learning is a lifelong endeavor. Now, for this presentation, we have Dr. John Sobkowicz. So this presentation was prepared and will present by him, a former partner with Thumber Engineering in Calgary, Alberta. Now it's semi-retired and living in Nanaimo, British Columbia. The information it contains is based on decades of making mistakes, some several times over, and eventually learning from them, and on the mentoring and support provided by more senior college and family members. The mistakes were his own. Dr. Sobkowicz was published more than 80 papers in oil sands engineering, water resources, foundation designs and performance, geotechnical instrumentation, natural hazards, and risk assessment fields. He was the recipient of the FRAG Strategic Technical Hours in 2013 from Association of Petroleum Engineering and Geoscientists of Alberta. Dr. Sobkowicz has been happily married for 49 years and has 5 children and 14 grandchildren. So please join me welcoming Dr. John.
Good day. Greetings to the University of Alberta graduate students and to members of the geotechnical community that are listening into the seminar. And thank you, Daniel, for that introduction. I thought you said there for a second that I had 40 grandchildren. You really scared me. Anyways, the presentation today is directed to young engineers, those in school and those that have been out of school for maybe 10 years or so. However, I hope that there's something of interest here as well for the, quotes, older engineers. Sorry, I'm having a technical problem here. I'll have to do it this way. The topic of today's presentation is lifelong learning. I hope to convince you of the absolute necessity to remain deeply and passionately engaged in learning throughout your life. There are a number of topics that we could cover, but today we'll only have time to address 3 of them. First of all, why we learn outside of school, the why, the how, the what of our post-school learning. Secondly, how to build relationship skills, primarily in the workplace. And thirdly, how to progress in your career. There are lots of other topics. We just won't have time to do justice to them today. And I picked these because I feel that our younger engineers can benefit the most from them. I'd like to start with a kind of a humorous and instructive anecdote about something that happened to me shortly after receiving a PhD from the University of Alberta in 1982. My immediate reaction on submitting the final version of my thesis was a great relaxation. I finally had finished this 5-year MSc PhD process and it was all done. And so I could relax for a little while. But shortly I started feeling a little bit sassy, actually. With some apologies to the carpenters, I felt like I was on top of the world looking down on creation. And the reason for that was that I had 5 years of solid years of engineering experience outside of my university education. I had achieved a PN status in British Columbia and Alberta, just finished up my PhD, and I felt like I was ready to tackle the geotechnical world. So I went back to work for R.M. Hardy and Associates for a couple of years, and then in the mid-1980s, I left consulting and joined Syncrude. This is a picture of I think an early picture of the Syncrude plant site. There were many young, enthusiastic engineers there. It was a high energy workplace, interesting and exciting work. And even though the workforce was quite young, there were still some strong mentors there. At Syncrude, I worked in tailings engineering, and I was responsible for this tailings facility you see in the upper left of the photo, what's called the Mildred Lake Settling Basin. One of my mentors was a middle-aged man that everybody called Mo. I don't think I actually ever learned his proper name. He was responsible for all the geotechnical field and laboratory work. He was a very friendly person. We developed a good relationship right away, and I was happy to work with him. One day, I would say after about, I don't know, a month or two of me being at Syncrude, he came into the office and he gave me a present all wrapped up. I unwrapped it, and it was a plaque, and on the plaque it was this message: it's what you learn after you know it all that counts. And I kind of laughed at it. I thought it was pretty funny. Stuck it up on the wall of my cubicle. And then I would see it every day, and I started thinking, what does this mean? And why did Mo give this to me? And then, you know, after a few days, some doubts started creeping in, and I was asking myself, you know, am I missing something? Am I lacking in knowledge or experience? Of course, the answer to that question was yes. And Mo was trying to get that message to me in a gentle way. We remained good friends, and he helped me on numerous occasions after that. So hopefully I was not in the position of this poor graduate who, when he was asked, I see you did well in school, but what real world skills do you have? All he could think of was tests. I can take tests. And I could certainly do that. So why is university just the start of our education? Well, because there's a whole other world out there. And what got you to the end of your university education is not sufficient to get you out into those vistas that you see ahead of you. What you've learned so far, your knowledge base, your skills, and so on, they're all good. They're valuable, and they will stand you in good stead in the future. But they're only a small part of what you need to really tackle the bigger world outside of the university environment. So what you typically learn in school, excuse me, what you typically learn in school are theory about, I hope, about soil and rock mechanics, geology, hydrogeology. You learn about investigating and testing concepts, and you have perhaps some limited practice of those. You learn about analyses. You get some practice solving what I call well-defined problems, the problems that your professor gives you, but not anything like the real world problems you're going to encounter. And maybe you get some help with design issues. Now, what is it that you need to learn outside of school? So I have 3 things on the left here, and they're just listed together because those are the ones we're going to talk about today: lifelong learning, relationship skills, and making progress in your career. There are, of course, other areas. Business savvy, I guess. You don't have to be a business person, but you need to be aware of what makes a profitable and healthy business. And if you go through any economic downturns, and I have experienced about three important, significant ones in my career. You become very sensitive to how a business stays afloat and how it stays healthy. There's a whole area of communication skills. How do you communicate verbally, in person to person, in small meetings, in large meetings? How do you communicate in written form? In what's an appropriate way to communicate in emails and in reports? How do you develop technical excellence? And I don't want to disappoint you by saying that you're not there yet, but there's still a lot to learn on the technical side. And then finally, and there's a larger list, but on this list, the final item I have, which is probably one of the more important ones, is developing a good set of values and having a solid character. So let's start with the concept of lifelong learning. There's a guy named Jay Sammet, who is a vice chairman of Deloitte and also has written a lot of best-selling business books. He focuses in on how we transform ourselves in the business environment. Here's a quote from him, just in case you need to know that more than one person holds an opinion on this. What Jay Sammet said was that lifelong learning is no longer a luxury, but a necessity for employment. When I first got out of school, as I mentioned, I rejoined R.M. Hardy and Associates. They sent me out into the field, and immediately I was on drill rigs, drilling holes for soil samples, for rock core, and so on. And one of the first jobs was drilling a rock core, and this could easily have been a picture of me examining some rock core, and maybe beside me is on the end there is the driller. So the driller asked me, he pointed to something. He said, "John, what's that?" And I looked at it, and I didn't have a clue, no idea. So I made something up because I was too embarrassed to admit that I didn't know. So I made something up. And he looked at me and he kind of laughed, and he looked at the driller's helper, who was also laughing. And then he kind of turned serious, and he looked at me again, and he said, "Don't be afraid to say, I don't know." Or don't be afraid to say, what does that mean? So if you want to learn, you have to be prepared to learn anything from anyone. It doesn't matter whether it's a driller or a driller's helper or somebody working in the lab or your neighbor across the road from you. Everyone has something to teach you, and you can learn from them if you're willing to be humble, to learn with humility, to have an open mind, to be teachable. Something else that you can do is to read voraciously, especially case histories, but there's lots of other good papers and books out there. You should listen carefully to what people tell you, especially the older engineers. You know, if you can get an older engineer to go out for a coffee or a beer and tell you some stories, really listen carefully to them. I know they've told them probably 1,000 times before, but there's something to be learned from those stories. And then finally, you should always observe what's going on around you and be thoughtful about it. So you'll go out to the workplace with what I call an old way of thinking, because you've had it for a long time. It's got you to where you are now, but it has a lot of preconceptions in it. And what you need to do through your observations and your listening and so on is to develop a new way of thinking that is more flexible and more humble and more likely to guide you in the right direction in your career. How do you learn? Well, painful experience. Experience is the best teacher. Painful experience is even a better teacher. My wife reminded me of a time when I was out working on a drill rig, and I was installing a packer system down in a borehole, and I was lowering it down with a winch system, and the winch slipped, and the handle spun around and smacked my thumb about 50 times before I could pull it out of the way, and it kind of turned the bones in my one thumb into kind of a mush. Well, not total mush, but it was pretty broken up. And it took a long time for that to heal until I could use my thumb again. So I learned something about safety from that. And I can't exactly say it was a treasured learning experience, but some of those painful experiences are. While you're learning things, you need to be capturing the information somehow, and then you need to be doing something about it. It's not enough to just say, oh, that's a good idea, and leave it there. You need to find a way to commit it to your long-term memory, which might mean capturing it physically somehow so that you can go back and refer to it. And then you need to take action on what you've learned. The final little thing on this slide that I want to get to is a comment that I've heard our good friend Ed McRoberts say many times over, which is that good answers only come after good questions. And Oscar Wilde had a similar sentiment. He must have been a teacher, because he said that only good questions deserve good answers. So from now on, if you ask a stupid question in class, don't expect to get a good answer. You should be thoughtful about your questions. How do you learn? You probably discovered this already, but learning comes from serious study and deliberate practice. And as we learn, we should stretch ourselves beyond our comfort zone. Somebody asks us to do something that we know nothing about. We may need some training, but be gung-ho and ready to go and do it. And then secondly, learning should include frequent feedback to identify and eliminate our weaknesses. We all have them. We need to recognize that we have weaknesses, and we should be desirous of people giving us criticism and feedback. There's a guy named Leo Buscaglia, who's an American educator, and he's quoted as saying this, that change is the end result of all true learning. And I would add on to that it's not just the result, but it's the goal, and it's the reward of all true learning. So as you learn, and as you really focus on learning in your life, you should also be changing. So let's go to relationship skills. I really like this quote from Helen Keller. Now we know, all of us know, that Helen Keller was born blind and deaf. She had almost no apprehension of the world around her. All she could do is feel things. This remarkable woman had some wonderful insights into life. And one of them was that alone, we don't amount to very much, and we can't really accomplish very much. But as we combine our efforts with other people, we can be very powerful in our efforts and in what we accomplish. So we're gonna apply this a little bit to relationships, but just before we do that, I want to take a little side trip about expectations when you're trying to get a job, and this will feed back into the topic. So what happens when you are looking for a job? Well, you have expectations about your work environment and your employer. I've read a number of job applications and a number of if somebody can have that background sound turned off, that'd be great. It's really distracting. I've also carried out job interviews, and you hear things like, well, I'd like to work in a collaborative environment. I want to work in a company where everybody helps each other, where employees have good relationships with each other. So those are your high expectations, as well as having an interesting job, obviously. But on the other side of the coin, you have an employer who has also got high expectations of you, the new employee. And they might want things like an employee who is self-confident and humble at the same time. Someone who has a good idea of where they need to improve and has a mind that's open to learning from anyone. They want somebody who understands the basic worth of the people around them and knows how to get along. People who are observant and patient. You notice I didn't say anything about technical capabilities yet. These are all personal characteristics that we're talking about. People that know how to communicate in a respectful way. People that don't procrastinate, that plan and take action, and so on. So there's this ideal, the expectations on the part of the employer and the employee. So we have the ideal, we have the reality, and then we have what can go wrong. So what can go wrong for you with the employer is you always have this question, will the job deliver as promised? You might want a job that you like or love, that pays well, that you're good at. If you get all of those things, you get a win. If you don't get all of those things, then you're left in one corner of this Venn diagram or another, and maybe not too happy with your job. What can go wrong for the as far as the employer is concerned, and something that you might be concerned about is, will you deliver as promised? And I can remember a couple of situations where working on projects and getting partway through, and then metaphorically having the same question mark as this poor fellow does here, and wondering, how did I get disconnected in the project that I was working on so badly? Usually going and asking a senior engineer how to slide that center portion of the deck over to the left and get everything connected up again. Now, so how this feeds back into the previous topic is I want to talk a little bit about how relationships can go wrong at work and how they can go right as well. As new engineers, we go into a workplace, or just new employees, we go into a workplace with certain expectations based on past experiences and past culture and so on. That may not fit the culture of the company that we join. And so we have to be really careful that we don't do certain things that get us off on the wrong foot. So I'm just going to list some surefire ways to ruin work relationships first. Well, be critical, be very critical of everybody else. Do work that involves effort by a number of people, but don't share the credit, assume the credit. If somebody comments or makes a suggestion to you or criticizes you, react with anger, react with sullenness, be passive aggressive in your behavior. All of those things are anathema for good relationships. Even less overt things like being disorganized, procrastinating, not planning, basically not delivering stuff on time, also ruins relationships. I don't know if you can see this comic here, but the person says, "You think this is bad? You should see inside my head." Some more ways to ruin relationships is seek to promote yourself. Don't pay any attention to those around you. I like this one here with Gene Wilder. Talk first, then pretend to listen. When I read that or showed my wife this one, she just laughed and laughed because it's such a temptation to do exactly that. Don't communicate with anyone. Some people are very talkative, other people don't want to say anything. What are some good ways to build? What are some ways to build good work relationships? First of all, appreciate the strengths of those that you work with, value their contributions. Listen more and talk less. I don't know if you've heard that saying that we have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason, but it's very applicable. The less we say and the more we listen, the better we're going to get along with people. And when we do say something, we say it respectfully and intelligently. If you have any sense of entitlement for whatever reason, and that might sound funny, but people do, if you feel you're better than other people for whatever reason, because of your culture or because of your education or anything like that, just get rid of it. You're in a work environment with a bunch of people. They're all the same as you are. They're all there trying to do a good job. So don't distinguish yourself. Don't try to elevate yourself above them. Have an honest desire to help other people succeed. And by honest, I mean you got to feel it inside. Celebrate the successes that other people have. Don't feel jealous. It's maybe natural to feel jealous when somebody else does well. We want to get beyond that. We want to start feeling good about other people's successes and mentor them and even help the other people to succeed. Value different opinions. People are going to have different opinions than you do. So listen to them, pay attention to them. Some you may agree with, some you may not agree with. The ones that you don't agree with, think about them, because there's probably some good points in there. People don't just say things for no reason. They have good reasons for thinking the way they think. And then really important in the workplace, no matter who you're talking to, interact in a respectful manner. Now, I want to just spend half a minute on this word pride. You hear people say, I'm proud of the job that we just did. And that's one quite legitimate meaning of the word proud or pride. But there's another meaning that has a very dark side to it. And that's when pride comes out of a feeling of superiority or even enmity towards other people. This is a debilitating weakness, and it's something that we need to work on and get rid of. You will know if you suffer from it, even a little bit, if your focus is on who is right. I'm right, not you. But what you really want to focus on is what is right, because we're all here trying to decide in a work situation what is right. And that requires humility rather than pride. So just a word of advice there. Let's go on to the last kind of area, which is on making progress in your career. You may, this may be your view right now. You're kind of at the beginning of your career. You're looking off into the distance there, and you might not even see that flag, or you might not even know what it is. You're full of enthusiasm and energy, and you're ready to just hit the ground running and climb up those stairs. So you might ask yourself these questions. Where am I going? What are my goals, and how do I know when I've reached them? How long will it take to reach them? And then what knowledge must I gain, and what skills must I develop along the way? Because you're not going to run up that long, steep stairway in 30 seconds. It's going to take probably quite a while. So what are some goals you might have? Well, you might have the goal of just wanting to develop some skills. So right at the beginning, you're focused on learning and knowledge and training, and you want to learn everything that you can about geotechnical engineering. So that's great. There's nothing wrong with that. That's good as a goal by itself. You might have a desire to get involved in complex projects and with complex equipment. So this is a artist's idea of what the Site C Dam is going to look like on the Peace River. We have people that are listening in today who are working there. They're probably familiar with the construction that's going on now. These are the diversion tunnels. We have people that are working on highway repair and construction, as we heard from Don Proudfoot a couple of weeks ago. So you might be interested in that kind of work. You might be interested in mining, getting involved in oil sands mining or coal mining. So all of these are worthy goals, and obviously there's some knowledge that you're going to need to do them. Maybe you're more of an entrepreneurial person and you want to build your own company, be an innovator. We can look at the pioneers of geotechnical engineering in Western Canada, people like Dr. Bob Hardy, Reg Thurber, Earl Clone. Even more recently, I guess, of my generation, Ian Bruce and Wayne Savigny. So these are people that started their own engineering companies. They grew them. They turned them into providing a company that provides quality services that have provided a great service for engineering in Western Canada. So again, that's another worthy goal. Your goal is going to be different than mine, and different than the person sitting next to you. However, there is one goal that we should all have, I think should be common to all of us as engineers, and that's to become mature, to become a mature engineer. And by that, I'm thinking that we have knowledge, the skills, the confidence to successfully tackle any engineering problem we encounter. And we know if we don't have everything in, inside our own head, we know where else to go to get the information and the resources and the people that we need. So achieving engineering maturity, to me, there's a short game and a long game. The short game we'll talk about first. That's what you're going to do in the next 5 to 10 years. And then the long game is something that will start now, but it'll go on throughout your life. And we'll come to that in a little while. Let's first look at what engineering maturity means in a little bit more detail. It doesn't necessarily mean having gray hair. A lot of people who have gray hair and are older, they are mature from an engineering perspective, but there's no cause and effect relationship. We have to, it takes not only time, but a lot of work on our part to get to that mature position. So some measures of maturity as you progress along in your life. One is developing character and social emotional skills. One is progressing along the dependence, what I call the dependent spectrum. We start off life being totally dependent, and we're happy being dependent as a child. Then by the time we become an adolescent, we don't want to be dependent anymore. We want to be independent. We want to do what we want to do. And so, there's that big struggle with our parents. And eventually we get to the point where in our later teens or early 20s, where we've reconciled everything with our parents, hopefully, and we now feel like we're independent. And then we progress into the quotes adult world, and we realize there's another aspect to this spectrum where we need to learn to be interdependent. A couple of more measures of maturity. One is how aware we are of ourselves and of others. By ourselves, I mean honest self-awareness, and of others, I mean seeing people clearly, with clarity and with empathy, not just as objects moving around us, but as real people with their own thoughts and their own desires and their own concerns. The last one on the list is psychological maturity, which is knowing how to behave, act, and think according to the circumstances and the culture of the society in which we live. And I think this one comes closest to what I think about when I think about engineering maturity. So I've done a lot of reading about this and borrowed ideas from many different people and kind of put together a model of learning that I think we use as we move towards being more and more mature from an engineering perspective. And my model, which is, as I said, not created out of the ether or out of a vacuum, but reliant on the work of a lot of other people. It has 5 stages. It's largely progressive. We start on the bottom left and we move to the upper right, but it has interactions between different stages and we cycle back and forth a little bit. The first stage is gaining information. We've been doing this since the first time we opened our eyes. We've been gathering data, and then within a short period of time, ideas. And we've continued to gather that all through our childhood and our adolescence and all through our schooling. And we're still doing it now as engineers. We're gathering data. The second stage is applying reason to the data that's in our brain, and that's starting to apply critical thinking when we understand what that means. and our purpose is to determine meaning. What is the meaning of everything around us? Now that's applied still on a sort of a piecemeal basis, but then we start to have all these pieces of information that we've attached meaning to. Now we're starting to build a knowledge base. We build models of how the world works. And we have theories of different things. We test them, those theories, and we find out they're right or wrong. So we have a feedback loop to ourselves, and we start integrating everything that we understand. So we're building a knowledge base. So you've built a knowledge base in some areas. Now we're talking about building solid knowledge base in geotechnical engineering. With time, as you apply knowledge in a number of different ways, you'll learn how to apply it in a practical manner and in a sensible manner. And that doesn't happen to start with, but over time it does. And as that happens, and as we become able to apply it in unfamiliar situations and to act and to judge correctly, we start actually developing some wisdom. And then eventually we get to the point where we can anticipate or predict things that might happen and prepare for what the future might bring. My wife drives me crazy because she spends 50% of her time in this foresight mode, and but has a lot of questions about what's happening in the future and how prepared we are for it. So this is where I think different levels of engineers are on this learning spectrum. The red arrows here mean people are competent. The blue arrows mean they're developing the capability. So as I mentioned before, junior engineers, I think, are gaining information and they're developing understanding, and they're starting to work on building their knowledge base. By the time you get up to an intermediate engineer, your knowledge base is getting pretty good. You're starting to develop some little nuggets of wisdom, a few. And then by the time you're a senior engineer, you've got a reasonable handle both on knowledge and on how to apply that knowledge. And you're really just working on being more, having more foresight in what you do. And if you get up to the sort of expertise level of engineering, then you have a solid handle on all of these stages of learning. So I just want to end this little section here with a quote from Arthur C. Clarke, who, as you know, is a science fiction writer, but may not know he was also a very accomplished scientist. And when he had his science hat on, he said this: "Before you become too entranced with gorgeous gadgets and mesmerizing video displays, let me remind you that information is not knowledge, knowledge is not wisdom, and wisdom is not foresight. Each grows out of the other, and we need them all." So let's look at some practical aspects of early career development. If you are one of these newly minted engineers, the first order of the day is to build up a comprehensive geotechnical knowledge base. You probably already have a lot of theoretical things under your belt. There's more to learn. If you've only come to geotechnical engineering through an undergraduate degree, then you probably want to go to graduate school, because that's where you'll get a good grasp of the second bullet point. And so I asked myself, what is most often missing? And ironically, it's the practical knowledge of soil, rock, and groundwater, and the related investigation and testing tools. This should not be the case, but it is with a lot of us. And practical knowledge is not obtained sitting in front of a computer screen. It's developed out in the field and in the laboratory. I remember being involved with some pile load testing at the Horizon mine back in the early days there, and we were doing conventional tests and tests against reaction frames, and we were doing pile load, these statmamic pile load tests where you mount a jet engine upside down on a pile and set it off. It was a fascinating experience. And this is the kind of experience that you're not going to get unless you're there while these things are happening. Certainly you need to have a good sense of soil and rock description. I remember when I went back to work at R.M. Hardy and Associates, there was a lab supervisor there named Gunnar Naslin, and he got a bunch of trays of different local soils to Edmonton, brought them into the lunchroom, and then dragged all the engineers of all, every engineer in the office and said, go through this circuit here and describe every soil that you see. And then we had a little comparison of this. And what we found was those people who had spent a lot of time in the field and in the lab knew how to describe soil, and those who didn't, even though they had this theoretical idea in their brain, they really weren't very good at describing soils and rock. You also need a good sense of basic and advanced lab testing, field mapping and investigation methods, including not just geotechnical features, but geology, geomorphology. You need to have good understanding of hydrogeological investigations as well. So these are all some practical things that you could be learning. Don't expect to learn them overnight. It might take you 5 to 10 years to master a lot of these. And this is the reason why geotechnical firms want their young engineers out in investing time in the field and laboratory. They all want to go out there for a month or two and then come back into the office and sit in front of their computer. That's not going to work properly. If without the practical knowledge, any engineering judgment that you apply will be severely lacking or even crippled. This will decrease the quality of your work, significantly increase the risk of errors and your exposure to liability. So get the solid basis right first before you start trying to do the fancy stuff. And as I mentioned before, the only place you're going to get it is in the field and in the laboratory. Now let's talk about the long game for a minute, a few minutes. One of the principles of the long game is adopting a balanced approach to developing maturity. If you focus on one area too much, then you're going to run into problems. Think about it as like you're learning to ride a bicycle. The bikes that I learned on back when I was a kid, they they only had two modes, pedal forwards or pedal backwards. But you look at the bikes that are available nowadays with all the fancy engineering improvements, and you can imagine somebody learning all about how to operate the gears and then prematurely getting on the bike and racing off down the road, changing into higher and higher gears, going faster and faster and faster, and then realizing they need to stop and realizing they don't know how to operate the brakes because they never paid any attention to it, and crashing and burning. So this is what I mean by adopting a balanced approach. You want to progress in all of these areas that we've been talking about in a roughly even manner. Something else that you can do as part of your long game, this I refer you to this book by Cal Newport called So Good They Can't Ignore You. He talks about building career capital, which means basically if you want to work with good people on interesting jobs, you need to bring something to the table. And that's something they call career capital. It's defined as rare and valuable knowledge and skills. So right now, you have a little bit of theoretical knowledge, and some of it might be considered career capital, but there's a lot of other knowledge that you don't have. And so you come to the table, the amount of career capital in your bag is pretty small. And so you need to work on evolving that. And you do that by pursuing this knowledge base and pursuing wisdom, as we've been talking about. And Cal Newport says that as you do so, as you get really good in those things, the people around you won't ignore you. Now, this doesn't mean that we strive to outshine our colleagues. There's no room in our profession for prima donnas, even though we have some. But really, they don't function very well in a work environment. what we're striving for is to develop the kind of career capital that means that other people on our team recognize the value that we have, that come to rely on us and trust us, and they come to talk to us about different issues that they're having, and then we can mentor and help them. So we become a stronger team member by developing our own career capital. Another good another good book by Cal Newport is called Deep Work. Talks about how to focus on success in a distracted world. So another principle here is being diligent, thinking carefully about our values and goals, planning regularly and effectively, avoiding distractions. And something that's really important for us, and maybe you wouldn't immediately realize it, is act out of our own choices. Don't expect or wait for other people to tell you what to do in your career. You think through it and plan it out. Certainly talk to everybody and anybody, but don't rely on them telling you what to do. And then you want to build momentum in your profession. So you work your plans, you check your progress, you revise plans when you need to, you keep your mind open to new opportunities so that you know how to revise your plans. And then finally, I'm going to give you a piece of advice here, which you won't find in any book anywhere. End conflict in your personal life. There is nothing that will scuttle or destroy your well-laid plans like serious and/or ongoing conflict in your life. I'm talking about conflict in your personal life. You have to get rid of it. I won't say anything more about that, except to tell you how important it is. The final little thing in this long game is you need to avoid burnout. Here we have a senior engineer. He's taking his lunch. He's on his lunch break, resting on a park bench, soaking in the sun, eyes closed, feeling the breeze on his face, listening to the birds, smelling the grass and the flowers, enjoying the quiet. He knows the value of avoiding burnout. And I want to give you the key principle to avoiding burnout. It's got 3 parts. Do not run faster than you have strength. Otherwise, you'll exhaust yourself and fall short of your goals. Now, this sounds obvious, and yet so many people do it because they're trying to run too fast, or they don't know how much strength they have. Secondly, if you want to accomplish something important, you must pursue it diligently. So you can't just sit there with your feet up waiting for stuff to be delivered to you. You have to pursue it, but you have to pursue it in a balanced manner. So do all things in a balanced manner, in wisdom and order. Don't be impulsive. Don't be impatient. Have your plans, work your plans, appreciate the progress that you're making. The choice is yours on this one. You can follow this approach as I've recommended, or you can run off and try to do all things at one time and run into problems. We remember there's life outside of work. So the same principles that you apply, to having a balanced life at work, you want to apply in your education, in your recreation, with your family and your friends, or your hobbies, any other activities that you have. And life will become hectic at different times. So you need to firmly have in your mind what your values are and your priorities are. And when your plans temporarily fall apart or whatever, you want to know those priorities so you know what to do. Last piece of advice I'm going to give you came to me when I was a young engineer. I was just out of about 6 months out of undergraduate at University of BC. I was in a geological engineering program there. I was newly married, contemplating having a family. And somebody said to me, "What's the most precious thing in your life?" And I thought about that for a while, because we have all sorts of possessions or things that are important to us. But what was the most precious? And being a newly married person, I said, well, I guess it's my family. He said, well, here's a piece of advice for you. And this advice has stood the test of time. And it's this: no other success in your life can compensate for failure in your home with your family. Now, we want to be successful in all areas, don't get me wrong, but we cannot sacrifice our families, our friends, and exchange that, the relationships there, for success in any other area of our lives. So while you're trying to figure out all your plans and figuring out how you're going to live a balanced life, make sure this is your top priority. It's great to enjoy what you do for a living, but it's also important to do some living. So make sure you do that. I hope I've convinced you now that it is what you learn after you know it all that counts. Thank you for this opportunity to speak to you today. I hope it hasn't been too rushed. I had a lot to say, and I have way more sitting off on the sideline somewhere that happy to discuss with anybody. If anything I've said struck a chord with you, I want you to go home and ponder it, think about it, decide what you're going to do about it, and then take some action to improve your life. And I'm certainly open to any discussions or questions or comments now, or if you want to contact me later on at this email or phone number to discuss things, I'd be quite happy to do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. John. So now for the Q&A session. Again, if someone in the room wants to ask, please raise the hand. Meanwhile, we are going to begin with some questions that people in Zoom have asked. So the first question is, developing meaningful self-awareness and humility is tricky. Any advice or suggestion on how can we get honest feedback on those software skills?
It is tricky. Well, there's a couple of things I can think of. One is take some time regularly to just think about how you're doing. And particularly if you have a strong feeling about something, if you feel anger or jealousy or whatever, when you've calmed down, sit down and think to yourself, why did I feel that way? What does that tell me about myself? And what should I do about that? So that's one way to make some improvements. Another thing that I can think about is to just take some time to appreciate the people around you. And honestly, look at what they're doing. And if you have to, take out a pen and paper and write it down. This is what I like about this person. And this is what I admire about them. That exercise of expressing gratitude for other people will help you to be more humble, and it will make you more open to the opinions and the ideas that other people have. So that's a couple of suggestions that I can think of.
Okay, we have another question. So, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So, thank you for your nice and useful presentation. I'm sometimes confused by the definition of an expert. Should be a geotechnical expert person specialized in all the areas of geotechnical engineering? As you know, these are many, such as dealing with soft soils, earthquake engineering, and liquefaction, and so on, numerical modeling, but it does not come for anyone in each area. What is your suggestion?
Can I just restate the question that I heard just to make sure I've got it right? Was the question, should we try to learn everything or should we focus on some areas?
Yes, specifically, I would say the question was, should be a geotechnical expert person specialized in all the areas of geotechnical engineering?
Well, there's lots of different areas, obviously, and the career path that you take will expose you to different areas of geotechnical engineering. And you, if you buy my thesis that the best way to learn is by experience, then that's what you're going to learn about you. Cal Newport discusses this a little bit in his book. Basically, what he says is you start somewhere and you start developing some expertise, you get some experience rather, and then you either like it or you don't. If you like it, you can keep going. If you don't, you can change direction. So you kind of find your own pathway to some extent within the constraints of the company that you're working for. And it may be that you get to the point where you have to change companies to get to into an area that you're interested in. So as you go along, you develop interests and then you pursue those interests. And as you're pursuing those interests, you're gaining experience and eventually building up your knowledge base to the point where you have some expertise, at least in that area. So you're certainly not going to be an expert in everything. You're never going to live long enough or have enough energy to do that. But you can, by some thought and a little bit of design as you work through your career, you can get yourself to a point where you're quite knowledgeable in several different areas of geotechnical engineering. You're practicing there. You're happy to be practicing there, and you've got this maturity and fulfillment because of the point that you've reached. So I mean, for me personally, my focus has been, say, over the last 30 years, it's been on mining and on water resources, dams, tailings dams, mine high walls. I've worked in lots of other areas. I've done foundation designs, done risk analyses, and so on. But so you want to have a fairly wide. I guess you're going to have a shallow, wide expertise, and then you want to have a deep, a center deep expertise that is the areas that you really want to practice in significantly. Hopefully that addresses the question. I'm not sure if it did or not.
Okay, in the room? Okay, so we have another question in Zoom. It comes from Colin. Thinking about the steps to becoming a major engineer, when is a good time to start focusing on a specialization? This may be a natural transition, but I am curious in your thoughts nonetheless.
I'm going to, I've got to open up the chat screen maybe because I couldn't understand that one very well, Daniel.
No problem.
Okay, is it the one that's on the screen now? Thinking about the steps to become a mature engineer. What is a good time to start focusing on a specialization? Yeah, that's a good question. I think I wouldn't worry about it in the first 10 years of your career, for sure, because I think it takes 10 years just to get a really good solid base down. When you're building your geotechnical knowledge base, the fundamental part of that knowledge base takes about 10 years to get in place. And it involves, both the practical experience I was talking about and the basics of the theoretical understanding in soil mechanics. So after that, I think that you could start to think about some kind of specializations, but I wouldn't. In high school, the high school counselors they say to the students, "What are you passionate about?" Okay, do that in school, do that in university. But the fact of the matter is they don't know what they're passionate about, because passion only comes as you have experience and as you learn what's really involved with a job. So you may decide, well, I'm sort of interested in this particular area of specialization, and you might get partway into it and think, well, maybe I'm not as keen about dynamic design of bridge foundations as I thought I was going to be. And, maybe I'm more interested in this area over here. So it's a little bit of, trial and error, I guess, in your career to actually get to the point where you can be passionate about some 1 or 2 or 3 specializations. So it's not as simple as what the high school counselors would make you think. But in any case, to answer Colin's question, I think you need to spend some time not worrying about a specialty and just getting the basics down.
Okay, thank you. Any question in the room? Okay, so let's continue with other question in the chat. So you mentioned the importance of getting out into the field as a newly minded engineer. How do you suggest we encourage these engineers to get out there when there is a reluctance?
Oh. You can't force somebody to do something, right? But you can encourage them, and you can try to educate them to the importance of something. I remember one young engineer, this is probably 20, 25 years ago, was very talented on the computer. And in fact, he wanted to get practical experience, but he was, I hate to say it, but he was almost hopeless in the field. So he's not exactly the person we're talking about here, because he recognized the area that he was weak, and he wanted to improve himself in that. But there are some engineers who just want to do what they consider to be the interesting stuff, or the sexy stuff, or whatever, letting a graduate student engineer run fancy analyses. I know it's necessary, but it's almost a disservice to them, because sometimes they've short-circuited the practical part of their education. And so when they come out of the PhD program, they just want to be off and running and doing all these good analyses. So somehow you need to educate them as to why it's important, and convince them that they need to spend some time on it. I don't have a simple answer for that one. There'll be some people who will refuse to do that, and what will happen is they will limit their ability to progress within an organization. As I mentioned earlier, if you don't have the practical part of your education, you're basically a threat to yourself and to the people around you. And so what happens is you do not progress, at least within a consulting company, and probably in most larger operators and so on too. You do not progress beyond a certain point, because people have to be looking over your shoulder all the time and making sure that the judgments that you're making are not immature, and that you're not assuming liability when you shouldn't be. So I suppose one way of tackling that problem is in getting people to recognize when they're making mistakes that are based on lack of practical experience. But some people may end up working as an intermediate engineer for the rest of their lives, because they're not willing to learn the things that they need to learn to go beyond that point.
Okay, Dr. John, thank you very much for your kind answers and your really good presentation. You have a lot of thank yous and congratulations in the chat. Yes, thank you very much for joining us today. It was for us a pleasure to having you in this seminar. See you all next week.
I'll put my my email in the chat here in case people need it.
Okay, we will really appreciate that. Actually, Colin already wrote the email.
Oh, she's got it.
So yes, for
Okay.
everyone that needs the email is already in the chat.
Great. Okay, well, thanks everyone. I enjoyed preparing and for the talk and giving the talk, and wish you the best in your, as you progress along in your engineering career.